Okay, my second talk, I was pleased and a little bit surprised when I was asked to talk about the history of antitrust, or competition policy, as it's called in Europe, in the United States, because it's a very U.S.-centered discussion. I was pleased because the research that I've done in my career that has been most concentrated and most archival and most primary rather than secondary, by reading sources of other people, is in the history of American competition policy, American antitrust policy. But again, surprised that non-Americans might want to hear about it. But here's the justification. The U.S. competition policy, the Sherman Act was the first antitrust competition law in the United States, at the national level in the United States, serves as, throughout the world, as the historical leader. America was the first country to enact legislation that we know now today as either antitrust or competition policy. One question is this policy necessary? Does it serve a useful purpose? One way, not the only way, but one angle at helping to answer that question is by looking at the history of that policy. What was it in response to? And did it have the effect that its initial sponsors, its initial proponents, wanted it to have? I spent a lot of time in the late 1980s buried in the bowels of the Library of Congress. You don't have to be a congressperson to work in the Library of Congress. Looking at original materials from the late 19th century regarding U.S. industrial history and the statutes and regulations that were proposed and enacted back then regarding that history. And I'm going to share with you in the next, I promise, 45, not hour and 15 minutes, what I uncovered. As with the first story, and as with the one I will tell you after lunch, what ties all three of these lectures together is that they all have, they all start with a standard narrative, a narrative that most people accept, and a narrative that I reject, or a narrative that I think is incomplete, if not outright wrong. So the narrative that most people, almost everyone, including most PhD economists, accept about American economic history is the following. For some reason, after the U.S. Civil War, which ended in 1865, but probably because of the railroads, the advance of the railroads, the United States, which had before been a highly competitive economy, became a highly monopolized economy. In the latter part of the 19th century, the United States economy was overrun by the robber barons, people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, James B. Duke, he was a tobacco entrepreneur, and J.P. Morgan, Leland Stanford. These business people gained monopoly power. Their companies gained monopoly power. These businesses simultaneously, this is how the narrative is told, simultaneously raised prices to harm consumers while cutting prices to harm rivals. I don't know how you do that at the same time, but somehow the narrative, at least when it's carelessly told, as it often is, you have John D. Rockefeller simultaneously raising prices and cutting prices. Suppose you can find ways to make that work, but it's not obvious. This is the standard narrative, that America became monopolized. Finally, by 1890, the American voter, and following the American voter, the US Congress had had enough. So Congress mounted its white horse in 1890, and on July 2nd of that year, passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is history's first competition law, which is history's first antitrust regulation, empowering the government to break up big businesses and monopolists in order to help consumers, in order to enable consumers to enjoy the low prices that consumers by right have to enjoy, and the more expansive output that consumers should enjoy because of competition. That's the standard narrative. I think almost nothing in that narrative is correct. The only part that's correct are the names of the business people and the fact that railroads play an important part in the story. As with the previous example, there was a moment for me when I started, that I can to this day date, when I began thinking about this issue. The moment before was when this student was flashing the lights at me in Toronto. For this lecture, it was reading a now very famous book by Robert Bork, who was a famous American law and economics scholar, an American judge. He was infamously nominated to the US Supreme Court in 1987 by Ronald Reagan, and his nomination was rejected. It had nothing to do with this book, by the way. But Bork's among economists, Bork is most famous for a book that he wrote in 1978 called The Antitrust Paradox. It's a great book, it's a wonderful book, except for the first chapter. And the theme of Bork's book goes like this. So this is 1978. Antitrust was started in America at the national level in 1890. So the theme of Bork's book is that he accepts part of the standard narrative. In 1890, Congress had had enough. Consumers were being gouged by these big monopolists named Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and James B. Duke. And Congress meant to put an end to it. So they passed the Sherman Act. But gosh, from the very beginning, the government and the courts got the Sherman Act wrong. From the very beginning, says Bork, the antitrust statutes have been misapplied. From the very beginning, contrary to Congress's clear intent, antitrust regulators and the US courts interpreted the antitrust statutes in an economically ignorant way. The antitrust regulators and the US courts interpreted the Sherman Act and the other antitrust statutes that followed not in a way to promote consumer well-being, not in a way to make the economy more competitive, not in a way to lower prices, not in a way to increase quality, to increase output, not in a way that Congress intended in 1890, but instead in a way quite the opposite of what Congress intended, and in a way quite the opposite of what any remotely respectable economist would recommend. For 88 years, said Bork, the Sherman Act and the other antitrust statutes have been interpreted in a way to make the economy less competitive. The typical antitrust case, when it was, or the antitrust action, when it was filed against a business or when it went to court, had the effect of reducing competition. Antitrust was used to stymie competition. It was used to make incumbent producers more comfortable by protecting them from new business practices and upstart entrepreneurial rivals. How awful, says Robert Bork, that for 88 years, from the very beginning, the Sherman Antitrust Act has not been interpreted according to Congress's clear intent. Because you can read in the historical record, the congressional record, as it's called, what people said on the floor of Congress. You can read that Senator Sherman said from time to time, well, we want this antitrust statute to make the economy more competitive. But the courts and the regulators got it wrong. I'm an economist, and I'm naturally suspicious when someone claims that something has gone wrong for 88 years. So I'm not the only one who thinks along these lines, I should point out. Other people have done so as well. I'll mention some of their names in a moment. But it occurred to me, as it occurred to other people, if Congress really meant for the antitrust statutes to do one thing, but if for 88 years the antitrust statutes had been used to do the opposite, why hadn't Congress stepped in and said, no, 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 we really, really do want you to do this one thing? Why has Congress just let it continue? Congress has control over the Federal Trade Commission. Congress has control over the other bureaucracies that have responsibility for enforcing competition policy in the United States. Congress has control over who's appointed to the U.S. courts. Congress can change the statutes to make its intent clearer. Why has it not done so in 88 years? I think Robert Bork is right in the following sense. The antitrust statutes in America, the Sherman Antitrust Act in particular, and the others, have indeed been used, or were indeed during that time period, used by the government and interpreted by the courts, not in a way to promote competition, but instead in a way to stymie competition. But I believe Robert Bork is wrong to argue that that effect is contrary to what Congress intended. In fact, I will argue that Congress's intent in 1890 was not to promote competition. Congress's intent in 1890 was to stymie competition. The point of U.S. antitrust statutes, in short, was not pro-competitive, it's anti-competitive. Sounds rather alarming, because at least when an American hears antitrust, it's an antiquated term, but that's the term we still use. We think, oh, that's pro-competition. When a European hears competition policy, well, you think it's pro-competition. I think there are reasons to be skeptical of this interpretation. So here's the history, as I've learned it, and some other people who've done research along with mine, who came along after me to reinforce it. Here's what I've learned about the history of antitrust in the U.S., the history of the world's first competition policy. I'll begin with an article written by a former colleague of mine, a man named Thomas DiLorenzo. It was my association with Tom that got me interested in these topics to begin with. And Tom was the first person who actually bothered to look at the industries that Congress was concerned about in 1890 to see if, in fact, there's any evidence that those industries were becoming monopolized. Now think of this. The Sherman Act is passed in 1890. My former colleague, Tom DiLorenzo, in 1985, so 95 years after the fact, is the first person ever to actually go into the congressional record, read what the congressmen were saying. They were all congressmen back then. Read what the congressmen were saying to identify which industries are monopolized. Then find data on those industries, find data on prices, find data on outputs, and see if there's any, if it's true that these industries were in fact becoming monopolized. Tom found 17 industries singled out in congressional debate leading up to the passage of the Sherman Act. 17 industries on which he could find reasonably good data. These were most of the industries that were mentioned repeatedly in the congressional debate. These were petroleum, John D. Rockefeller, and oil, bituminous coal, steel, tobacco, not so much cigarettes, tobacco. These are the big ones, but there were other industries as well. He went into the historical record, found pricing data on these going back to 1880. He found output data on these industries going back to 1880. Now, if you're an economist and someone tells you that an industry is monopolized, what do you predict if the claim is true? What do you predict will be the result on price and output? You would predict that if the industry is becoming monopolized, the prices in that industry will rise and the output of that industry will fall, at least relative to some appropriate baseline. If not in absolute terms, at least relative to some baseline. So Tom found pricing data, he found output data. He also gathered pricing and output data on most of the other major industrial categories, products from the other major industrial categories in the US. And what he found was that the industries that were singled out in congressional debate as ones that needed to be reined in because of their alleged monopolization were industries in which the prices fell unusually rapidly over the decade from 1880 to 1890, and outputs rose unusually fast over that same decade. There was one curious exception to that rule, and it was whale oil. Somehow the whale oil industry declined. It's no mystery as to why. It's because the petroleum industry rose. The only mystery is why anyone would worry about the alleged monopolization of whaling, but somehow this was in the congressional record. Anyway, the point is the industries that in the historical record are the ones that motivated Congress, at least if you judge by Congress's own words, to enact a competition policy, are industries that at the time seemed to have been the most competitive in the United States. What's going on? So this, reading Tom's article, prompted me to want to explore this issue further. There have been a handful of other studies that pointed out, almost in passing, that the Sherman Act of 1890 is not really the first antitrust statute in the world. What really is the first antitrust statute in the world is a series of antitrust statutes, competition policies, that were passed at the state level in the United States in 1889 and 1890. This is very curious. For some reason, starting in 1889, US states, which back then even more so than now, really did have some independent jurisdiction that was not interfered with by Uncle Sam, by the national government. US states suddenly burst into this activity of enacting antitrust statutes. Why? Prior to the enactment of the Sherman Act, 14 US states enacted their own antitrust statutes. They're now called baby antitrust statutes. Starting in 1889, up until the Sherman Act was passed in 1890. Some states continued to do it after the Sherman Act was passed. So I started to look into, this is a research that I did, into the state actions on antitrust. What is it that motivated the states? Because if we can find what motivated the states, we probably will find what motivated the national government. It's going to sound like a minor point, but before I go on, I want to inform you that back then, the US Senate was not popularly elected. The House of Representatives was popularly elected. The US Senate was elected by the states. The states chose, the state legislatures in each state chose each state's 2 US senators. So the US Senate was much more a body representing the interests of state government, whereas the House of Representatives was popularly elected. And antitrust, the Sherman Antitrust Act found its origin and greatest support in the United States Senate. So what happened at the state level? Why all of a sudden in 1889 did the US states start passing antitrust statutes. The untold story of US competition policy has really very little to do with John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie. These people were mentioned in the congressional debate because they were well known. They were known to be very rich. And if you want to demonize some activity, you point to John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie. See, rich people. There have never been people as rich as this before in America, and that's true. These people were unprecedentedly wealthy because of their industrial enterprises. But in fact, I believe that competition policy was sparked not by the activities of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil or Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel or by any of the other commonly mentioned demons. It was sparked, in fact, by an industry that you've heard of, but you probably don't think much of, and that is, at least what's called in America, meat packing. It was started, the antitrust was sparked by a butcher named Gustavus Swift. That wasn't his intention, but it's what he wound up doing. Here's the story. Gustavus Swift was a butcher born in Boston to parents, both of whom immigrated from Germany. And he and his brother operated a butcher shop, or butcher shops, in Boston. Swift was pretty entrepreneurial, and for some reason it occurred to him at one point that if he could centralize the slaughtering of meat, that would be a revolutionary new way to make money. Butchering's really expensive. Until the late 19th century, butchers were truly butchers. They butchered the animal. Until the late 19th century, if you ate fresh meat, the fresh meat you ate was killed within just a few miles of where you ate it. And it was killed by the butcher. At least in the US, what we call butchers today are no such thing. There are no butchers left anymore. We have meat carvers. So at an American supermarket, you have someone called a butcher who's in the back of the supermarket. And into the supermarket comes this already killed carcass of a cow or a pig. And then the butcher at the supermarket pulls out his carving knife and slices it into smaller pieces. That's what we call a butcher today. That's what Americans think of as a butcher today. Real butchers, until the late 19th century, were true butchers. I mean, they would kill the animal. That's what a butcher did. And only later did he, it was usually almost always a he, slice it up. So Swift literally one day pulls out a map, and he's looked at a railroad map, and he has this bright idea. If he could centralize meat slaughtering, he's going to try to do it. But to do it, he needed good transportation, and he needed refrigeration. Good transportation was supplied by the railroads. So the railroads really did grow. They started to grow before the U.S. Civil War. They really expanded after the U.S. Civil War. The first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. going from East Coast to West Coast was completed in May of 1869. And then we had three others that quickly followed. And the United States was a spider web of rail lines for the first time, connecting cities that previously were basically disconnected from each other, reducing to hours travel that would once take days or weeks. Swift looks at a map and discovers that Chicago is the best terminal. That's where most, if you wanted a central place to ship things from, Chicago, on rail, Chicago was the best place. So Swift starts to think, I want to set up a big butcher shop, one that has never before been seen in history, one like it's been completely revolutionary in Chicago. And I want to ship the dead, slaughtered carcasses across the country so that they can be retailed in different cities, having been killed in Chicago. But he needed refrigeration. He takes his relatively modest savings, he hires an engineer, and basically gives the engineer the task of designing an economically efficient refrigerated railroad car. It was a gamble, but the gamble paid off. In November of 1877, Swift had moved from Boston to Chicago. Swift slaughtered some cows. He put these cows on a railroad car and shipped them to his brother in Boston. He waited until November, by the way. He wanted to make sure the weather got cold enough, and just in case the refrigerated railroad car didn't work, but it did work. When it worked, things happened very quickly. Swift builds a giant slaughtering plant in Chicago. He builds stockyards, and he keeps cows and pigs in his and some sheep in his stockyards. He takes those animals from those stockyards, brings them into a slaughtering plant. He centralizes the slaughtering. He takes the carcasses, puts the carcasses on refrigerated railroad cars, and those railroad cars spread out throughout the country. They go to Atlanta, they go to New Orleans, they go to Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, Dallas. Soon they were going to California. Now this is another example. You have to think about what life was like prior to the world that you know. Prior to 1877, no one ate fresh meat that was not killed within a short distance from where they ate that fresh meat, because it didn't last. You ate salted meat, you ate smoked meat, you ate canned meat. You did not eat fresh meat. For the first time in human history, people started eating fresh meat that was slaughtered 1,000 miles away. I imagine it would be like if someone came down today and offered you some meat and said, here's some meat, it was slaughtered on Venus. You'd be kind of suspicious. Slaughtered on Venus, I never had that before. That's kind of probably what it was like. You're in New York and someone says, here's some meat, it's fresh, and it was slaughtered in Chicago. Won't that kill me? No, refrigeration keeps the bacteria down, cleaned by capitalism. People loved Gustavus Swift's meat, mostly because it was really cheap. Swift had this great idea. He would dramatically reduce the cost of slaughtering by doing it on a large scale and then shipping it. So even after taking the shipping costs into account, the price of meat over the decade of the 1880s fell by about, the real price fell by about 30%. That's a huge reduction in the cost of a major staple of the American diet. People loved it. Now imagine if you are a traditional butcher, how you feel about this. You were in a line of work that for millennia has been pretty secure. People like meat, and as people get richer, they like even more meat. You were doing pretty well. America was becoming a richer country, and so you're slaughtering your cows and your pigs and your sheep. Suddenly you start losing business. People aren't buying your meat, they're buying meat slaughtered in Chicago. And you can't slaughter meat and sell it at a price as inexpensively as can Gustavus Swift. By the way, just FYI, as soon as Swift's company began to make money, which it did almost immediately, other competitors moved in. So Philip Armour moved in, a few others. By the 1890s, you had what we call the Big Four Chicago meat packers. They were all bitterly competitive with each other. That helped to drive down price even further. There's no evidence also, no evidence, despite some contemporary assertions to the contrary, there's no evidence that the meat slaughtered in Chicago was any worse for consumers. It didn't have any health. There was no evidence of a greater incidence of health problems caused by people eating meat slaughtered in Chicago, as opposed to eating meat killed in the more traditional local butcher way. Butchers were quite upset by this. Butchers kicked into action. Starting in the mid-1880s, butchers, and as far as I can tell, this was a unique phenomenon in the United States. It's the first time this really happened on a national scale. Butchers organized groups to politically attack Gustavus Swift and the meat packers in Chicago. The International Butchers Protective Association was created. There was nothing international about it. It was all American, but it was called it sounds better, the International Butchers Protective, International Butchers Protective Association. And they would have these meetings with each other, and they would invite to their meetings state legislators, and they would complain, say, look, we're getting this meat shipped in from out of state, And it's taking away our business. And, you know, even though we don't have any evidence, it's probably bad for the people. And it's going to put us out of work. We're a tradition. We're good people. We've been in this line of work forever. You got to do something. Well, what can a state legislator do? A state legislator in Mississippi or Louisiana or Alabama or New Jersey doesn't have any jurisdiction over what goes on in Illinois, where Chicago is. But they do have jurisdiction over what goes on in each of their individual states. So there was this flurry of meetings in the mid-1880s, a shockingly big deal back then. The International Butchers Protective Association, they would meet, would gather steam, they would meet in these different states. Governors from different states, legislators from different states would show up. Governors would give the opening address. U.S. senators started to attend. Remember, the U.S. Senate's elected by the states. U.S. senators would start to attend these meetings. Just listening in on the proceedings. It'd be like, you know, some politicians coming in listening to our proceedings here, although we're not butchers. And so, at one point, the International Butchers Protective Association, they draft two statutes. And so they write up two draft statutes. And they commit to take these statutes back to the states, to their respective states, and do all they can to get the legislature to pass them. One statute was an inspection statute. And this statute read, basically, any meat not slaughtered in the county, the small jurisdiction in which it is sold, is considered to be too dangerous to be sold, and therefore it is illegal to sell any fresh meat not slaughtered in that county. This statute was passed by most of the states who sent representatives to these meetings. The second draft statute that was passed was an antitrust statute. This was the first antitrust statute ever drafted in the history of humankind. It was taken back to the states like the inspection statute. And this draft statute prohibited, notably, meat being sold below a fair price. And when the states would meddle around with the language a bit. But the statute was obviously aimed at stopping price cutting, not price hikes. Monopolists don't cut prices. Monopolists raise prices. But the first antitrust statute was drafted to stop price cuts, not price hikes. States passed these. That's the origin of why all these states suddenly passed these antitrust statutes. Some of the governors, some of the U.S. senators had attended these meetings. And by the way, these meetings apparently were very interesting. By the end of the period, by the 1887 or 1888, when these meetings were really getting going, they would have religious overtones to them. Preachers would come in, and they would grand spectacles of celebrating butchers and gods as sort of, you know, one of God's noble professions that mustn't be upended by new forms of competition. So U.S. senators started to attend these. Among the U.S. senators, Senator John Sherman did not attend, but Senator George Vest of Texas was among those who attended. Now, you almost certainly have never heard of George Vest. Most Americans have never heard of George Vest. But George Vest has the honor of chairing the first Senate committee to investigate an alleged nationwide economic problem. It's called, in history, the Vest Commission. And you won't be surprised to learn that the Vest Commission was charged with exploring and studying the reasons behind the troubling fall in the price of meat that is happening in the 1880s. And what can we do to stop this awful plague that is afflicting America? George Vest was also a close political associate of Senator John Sherman. I'll tell you in a moment how John Sherman's name got on to the act. He actually wasn't all that influential in it, but they needed his name. George Vest was the senator who was most singly important in pushing this. It's not a coincidence he's from Texas, because another industry that was harmed by, or actually obliterated by Gustavus Swift was the Texas cattle industry as it existed back then. You all know the stories of the American cowboy. It was a very short-lived period in American history. It was about a decade starting in the late 1860s, going up through the late 1870s, and you'd have these cattle that would graze on the southern grasses of Texas, and then it would be driven by the cowboys up the Chisholm Trail to Cincinnati and Chicago, where the cattle would then be put on stock cars and shipped by rail to the various butchers around the country. The number of cows that would die on average was about half. That was just an expected cost while being shipped. That was an expected cost of doing business. The cows pretty much made it safely while being driven by the cowboys to the big rail terminals in Cincinnati and Chicago. But once they were put on stock cars, about half of them would die. They're not eating, they're stuffed onto these stock cars. They would lose a lot of weight, even the ones that lived. This is one of the reasons that sparked Gustavus Swift's interest in changing the way that meat was slaughtered in the United States. So Swift started stocking his own cattle in stock yards in Chicago. So suddenly a lot of the beef barons in Texas, no one wants to buy their meat anymore. The way they did business was being upended by Gustavus Swift. So you had the cattlemen and you had the butchers who hated what was going on in Chicago with this centralized meat packing. George Vest was beholden, not surprisingly, to the cattle barons in Texas, and he was intent on putting Gustavus Swift out of business. You can't just pass a law and say, we don't like meat packing, so it's illegal. You got to find a more subtle way to do it. And George Vest was very impressed with the antitrust statute drafted. He would go to these meetings. He's very impressed with the antitrust statute drafted by the Butchers Protective Association and sent to the states. And it was George Vest who first proposed that an antitrust statute be passed at the national level. Let's do it at the national level, what's being done at the state level. There was concern that not all states would pass it, or not all states would enforce it as well as it might be enforced by Uncle Sam. And so George Vest, clearly with the interest of protecting cattle barons and with the support of other senators who wanted to protect the local butchers, was the major force behind introducing antitrust legislation into the U.S. Senate. The point of the Sherman Act was from the beginning to protect butchers and cattlemen from increasing competition from a completely new entrepreneurial form of production, Gustavus Swift's meat slaughtering plants in Chicago. Let me end by giving you telling you a little bit about why John Sherman's name wound up on. First of all, Sherman was widely respected. He was sort of an elder by 1890. He later went on to be President William McKinley's Secretary of State. His older brother, William Tecumseh Sherman, was a national hero, not so much a hero in the South, but he was a hero in the North. He was after Ulysses S. Grant, he was the most important general in the victorious U.S. Union Civil War winning army, but he was a Republican. And like all Republicans, his major issue, he had two, but one of his major issues was high tariffs. The Republican Party back then was the high tariff party. It was to protect businessmen from competition. John Sherman was obsessed with the tariff. He wanted higher tariffs. So did Senator William McKinley, also want higher tariffs. John Sherman would campaign. He would write articles about the wonders of what higher tariffs would do for America. He threw his support behind a statute bill that was passed in October of 1890 called the McKinley Tariff. That at the time was the largest single tariff increase in U.S. history. John Sherman and George Vest was another big supporter of this. John Sherman, the man whose name is to many people synonymous with protecting consumers from monopoly power and keeping prices low and keeping competition vigorous, was a major supporter of the largest single tariff hike in U.S. history up until that time. Those two things are not consistent. Anyway, someone had, I don't know who it was, had the good sense to point out to John Sherman. He said, you know, Senator Sherman, you're going on and on about the tariff, and there are a number of people out there who do point out that the tariff creates monopoly power. So you might want to find a way to portray yourself as a friend of the consumer, as opposed to being a friend of business, a friend of people who want monopoly power. Your name is very valuable to us. You're widely respected. So how about, I'm paraphrasing, no one actually said these words, but this was the deal made to John Sherman. You lend your name to this, we have this completely new revolutionary statute. It's called an antitrust statute. And we will sell it to the American public as a statute designed to promote competition. And that way, when you support the tariff, you can say, me? Pro-monopoly? Huh, my name's on the Antitrust Act. How can I be for monopoly? I believe that tariffs promote competition, not monopoly. I'm Senator John Sherman of the Sherman Antitrust Act. I'm that guy. So he agreed to put his name on the statute. The statute itself was written by, I forget his name, he was a senator from Vermont or New Hampshire. But George Vest was the main Senate guy behind the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the goal had nothing to do with promoting competition, it had everything to do with restricting competition, particularly competition coming from Gustavus Swift. The story, the immediate end to this story wasn't so happy for George Vest and John Sherman, because in 1892, to be certainly one of the best U.S. presidents ever, and I think that's a very small list, Grover Cleveland, nothing to do with the city of Cleveland, was elected president for the second time. And Grover Cleveland was a pretty laissez-faire guy. He did not like the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so he basically called it off. He didn't bother to enforce it. After Cleveland left office, William McKinley became president. He liked the Antitrust Act. He started to enforce it. And really, so from the time of William McKinley being in office until the time of Jimmy Carter being in office, the Sherman Antitrust Act was used in ways to suppress competition. Courts consistently, in my view, got it right, at least from a political standpoint. It was not meant to promote competition, unlike what economists were led to believe, and unlike what the public was led to believe. Fortunately, in my view, a lot of good work done, particularly at the University of Chicago, the law school and economics department, and by Robert Bork, showed how the way the antitrust statutes in America had been interpreted actually harmed consumers and didn't benefit consumers. And so starting right around the time Robert Bork's book was published, starting in the late 1970s, antitrust in America has made, it's one of the few policy areas that has been noticeably improved. It's still around, it still is abused from time to time, but unlike for most of its history, it is not a policy that's used much, and it's no longer the impediment to competition that it was for most of its history. So I think I have gone just a few minutes over, so I will stop, and I'm happy to go on further if you like. I like this story, but let me pause here. Oh, let me say, I don't know that much about the history of the EU's competition policy, or I know a little bit about how it has been implemented, which seems consistent with the early implementation of antitrust in the United States. But I think this kind of perspective gives you a different lens through which to look at the real motives behind people who push for competition laws or antitrust laws. Thank you. Questions? That was crystal clear. I understand it's a very U.S.-centric story. But what's not U.S.-centric about it is a couple of things. It's the dynamism of competition. I believe that to this day still, the single best description of competition, real competition as it actually plays out in markets, as opposed to how it is described in economics textbooks, is Joseph Schumpeter's description of competition in his 1942 book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. That's the book where Schumpeter coined his famous term, creative destruction. Schumpeter said, look, competition in the real world, in real modern capitalist world, isn't so much about lowering prices. Yeah, prices fall. But really what competition does, the important forms of competition, is not just increasing outputs of using familiar ways of producing, of known goods and services. It's entrepreneurs who have completely new ideas for new products, completely new ideas for ways to produce existing products. People who revolutionize things. They don't just trim away at the margins of cost. They dramatically cut the cost. They don't just moderately improve product quality. They introduce completely new and far better products than were known before. That's what competition is about. And it's that kind of competition that creatively destroys older ways of doing business. The destruction's obvious. The butchers, their lines of work were destroyed. The creativity is not as obvious. But the creativity was Gustavus Swift. It's not as romantic, perhaps, as a small butcher. You don't know the person, unlike when you ate meat butchered in your town. You don't see the person who actually killed the cow that you're eating, or who killed the pig whose bacon you're enjoying. That person is some stranger far away. But Swift's innovation did dramatically reduce the cost of meat in the US. Here's a modern twist to the term, because no one has any questions. I'm happy to ask questions, but I'll keep talking until you ask me a question. Now there's a big fad for grass-fed meat in America. I confess, I was skeptical. I didn't think I thought, who cares? Grass-fed, corn-fed, who cares? I'm a convert. I think grass-fed beef tastes eating grass-fed beef tastes much better than eating corn-fed beef. Corn-fed beef was invented by Gustavus Swift. So he's got all these cows in Chicago. You can't graze cows in Chicago. So you keep cows in stockyards and you feed them corn. Apparently the cows like the corn better than they like eating grass. Cows apparently love corn. But it's a different food, and so it makes the cow meat taste differently. Perhaps it shows something about human psychology. An unintended benefit to consumers of Gustavus Swift's innovation was corn-fed beef. People were accustomed to grass-fed beef. And apparently, given the taste of the time, you can read this in local newspaper testimonials. You can find it in analyses written of the era. I'm quite convinced that the typical person in the 1890s, for example, thought that corn-fed beef was just wonderful. They never tasted anything like it. This is great. It's much better than this grass-fed stuff. So they liked the corn-fed beef. So not only was it lower priced, not only was much more of it produced, not only was it just as healthy and less, no less threatening to your health than was traditionally butchered beef, it tasted better. I happen to like the grass-fed beef. Here's another interesting fact I like Gustavus Swift. Gustavus Swift's one of my heroes. He's not well known. Yeah.
In terms of what you're speaking, can you please more like elaborate on the concept of monopoly power? Because you seem to speak about a monopolist, right?
Yeah.
You seem to like it.
No, I don't like monopolists at all. Right? What I'm arguing is that you have to be careful what you identify as a monopolist. Right? Gustavus Swift wasn't a monopolist. Gustavus Swift was he was a big firm. And one of the ways that Gustavus Swift's firm was able to be portrayed as a monopolist was by its antagonists pointing to it and indicating that it is big. But big is not the same thing as monopoly. Swift, first of all, had a lot of competition, other big firms. And the ultimate proof of monopoly, the ultimate evidence of monopoly at any rate, would be what's happening to prices and output. And the prices of meat continued to fall, the output of fresh meat continued to rise. So that tells me that that industry was not monopolized. In the same way we say with Standard Oil. Not that Standard Oil's, John D. Rockefeller was easy to demonize, in part because he lost all his hair. He didn't look friendly by the 1890s. He had alopecia. But Standard Oil was big. Standard Oil by 1890 had 98% of the refined kerosene market in the US. Kerosene was the main consumer petroleum product back then. So that seems like monopoly. But the price of kerosene continued to fall, and Standard Oil's output continued to rise. I agree with Schumpeter that monopoly, absent government prohibitions on entering an industry, absent government restrictions on the ability to compete against currently successful producers. Monopolies are almost impossible to maintain for any length of time in an open market. I know of no example, not a single one, of a firm without special government protection engaging in output restricting policies for any length of time in a way that can be deemed to harm consumers. Now, the way I worded that, obviously, it has some qualifications. But if you look at the serious economic historians, not the muckrakers, not the people who are writing for popular consumption, not the people who are writing for the New York Times Magazine, but people who are writing in the economic history journals. The ones who set out to study the history of monopoly, they find it almost impossible to find a market-based monopoly. There are some exceptions. They find it almost impossible to find a market-based monopoly. They find big firms, but they don't find monopolists. And I think that's part of the moral of the story here. Swift was big. He wasn't a monopolist. Yeah.
Is it true that the Standard Oil market share actually fell before the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed? And do you know?
Before it was passed? No.
Before.
Not before it was passed. What you're probably thinking is Standard's market share fell long before it was sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was sued by the U.S. Justice Department in 1907 under the Sherman Act. And it was found guilty of violating the Sherman Act in 1911, and it was broken up in 1911. And that's a different story, but if you look at what happened to, I think it was 1893, maybe 1894, starting in that year, Standard's market share began to fall. John D. Rockefeller, as brilliant as he was, and he was a brilliant businessman. He was single-mindedly obsessed with efficiency. He's not a guy I think I would have enjoyed spending time with. First of all, he didn't drink, right? So that rules you out for me. But he was single-mindedly obsessed with efficiency. But even the best businessman isn't omniscient. He didn't anticipate the you could get oil out of the Gulf of Mexico. So when Gulf Oil began, what is now Gulf Oil, the predecessor of Gulf Oil, started exploring for oil offshore, that caught Rockefeller completely off guard. And exploration for oil in the Gulf, and also exploration for oil in some other parts of Oklahoma, were things that Rockefeller thought were unprofitable. He wouldn't do it. By the time his company was sued under the Sherman Act, his market share had been eaten into significantly. I'm trying to recall the precise numbers. Don't quote me on this. I believe it was 98% in 1890. So if you just look at the refined kerosene market in the US, now this does not include imports, by the way. So it's not that John D. Rockefeller was selling 98% of all kerosene sold in America. A little bit of it was imported. But of all the kerosene refined in the United States, John D. Rockefeller refined 98% of it. I think the number by 1907 is 67%. I think it was down to 67%. That number could be off. It was still significant, but long before he was even sued, his market share had fallen and it was continuing to fall. This was a point, by the way, that his defense team brought up, but it didn't have any sway apparently in the courts. Yeah.
Do you want to comment a little bit on the future of the U.S. competition policy, of the antitrust? What do you think? In what direction is it going? Will there be more convergence between European competition policy and the U.S., or will it be divergence? We're currently negotiating, for instance, this trade and investment partnership, trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU. And
that's part of it.
Yeah, to a great extent, it's also about competition issues. So what do you think?
I can't speak with any authority on the European issues. And no one can speak with any firm authority in the future, of course. The future is unknown, but as a professor I once said, it's unknown but not unimaginable. In my opinion, antitrust in the United States has been pretty harmless for the past 30-odd years. Not completely, but largely it's been defanged. It's just not used that much. There's a handful of exceptions from time to time. I believe this occurred because of a change in ideas. The courts who have the ultimate, U.S. courts have the ultimate say over whether or not antitrust moves forward or not, whether or not you can hold a company liable under the antitrust statutes. The courts currently, even ones nominated, judges nominated by Democratic, so more progressive, interventionist presidents, the judges by and large accept the prevailing economic scholarship on antitrust. That prevailing economic scholarship says that, really most of what businesses do that look to the naked eye to be monopolistic is really, those are forms of competition. And so my prediction, or maybe this is just my hope, is that the future of U.S. antitrust is the past that it has had for the past 30 years. Now, ideas, they change once, they can change again. So I don't rule out a reversion to an earlier worse state, but I don't see any evidence now that there'll be a major revival of antitrust in the United States. I just don't. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I'm correct on that. Someone else?
Yes, I wanted to ask almost the same. Why, at least in Europe, we are in the same situation like in the US 130 years ago.
You are.
I think with antitrust lawyers.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed. I know you all probably know more of the details than I know, but I see some of it comes out of Brussels. Is, Google gets threatened because it has a large market share. A large market share, if you think about it for only a second, maybe that seems like evidence of monopoly. But if you think about it for 2 seconds, you think, well, how did it get large market share? Maybe it earned it. Maybe it's so good. Maybe it's pleasing consumers so much that that's the reason it has large market share. And so that large market share, rather than be interpreted as evidence as it had been in the United States for most of the past 130 years, rather than interpret large market share as evidence of monopoly and something that ought to be eliminated, might be interpreted as evidence of competitive pressures leading that company at the moment to please consumers well enough so that it has large market share. I was talking to a journalist yesterday, and Google now seems gigantic. You know, it is gigantic. It's a major part of almost everyone's life. I don't know what my life would be like without Google. Seems dominant. There are these periods, throughout all periods of history, at least in the United States, and my guess is this is true in Europe too. The way things are now, there's a bias toward thinking that the way things are now is destiny. That the companies that are large today are the ones that will be large forever because, my gosh, they're large now. I can't imagine, thinks the typical person, how this firm can ever lose market share. It's got too much power. But I think we all, even old me, we are all in this room, young enough, so that within our lifetimes, there will be some innovation that bankrupts Google, or that causes Google to so radically change its business plan that it is not the Google that we recognize today. If you look at American economic history, the company that in the 1930s was considered to be the great threat to American prosperity and happiness was the A&P supermarket. A&P supermarket now is basically defunct. People say A&P supermarket, Atlantic to Pacific, it's A&P. It's so dominant, it can't be destroyed. New forms of distributing and retailing food emerged. That's what did in A&P. A&P couldn't keep up. The new forms of exploring for oil significantly ate into John D. Rockefeller's market share. This is how markets work. I don't believe that we need bureaucrats or politicians in places of power anticipating what the future will hold. If a company has a dominant market share, if a company is in fact making excess profits, that is like blood to a shark. That attracts, if the economy is sufficiently open, that attracts other entrepreneurs and other producers into that market, which reduces those companies' market shares if they don't respond by acting competitively. Yep.
But that's the thing you mentioned just now, that, well, about the openness of the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact of being a monopolist is not really illegitimate, right? Everybody wants to become a monopolist. That's the legitimate aim of an entrepreneur. What's should be prohibited is the use of that monopoly later. And that's the policy in the European Union, that the concept of abuse of the monopoly, well, the structure of the economy as well. But in the US, as I understand, this abuse is also protected, like from the utilization of the market power that an entrepreneur can get by just, I don't know, making access to the market also.
It's an open question about, well, it is a question about what does it mean to abuse market power. In the US, this is mostly what Robert Bork complained about. And I think it is abundantly clear in the history of American antitrust from the time it really began to be enforced in the mid-1890s until the late 1970s. what was considered to be the abuse of monopoly power were practices that damaged rivals, practices that harmed other competitors, not practices that harmed consumers. From time to time, always, there would be stories told about how these practices also hurt consumers. But it's quite clear from the history of US antitrust that abusing monopoly power, as it was called, were practices that hurt rivals. It's the rivals of the firms that were prosecuted under the antitrust who went to the government to seek antitrust prosecution against the other firms. It was the rivals who brought suit against the firms under the antitrust statutes. It was the rivals who would say things like, literally, they would say things like, my competitor is abusing its monopoly power by charging predatorily low prices. You can construct theories, it's been done. You can construct theories in which it's possible for a firm either to gain monopoly power or to protect monopoly power by dramatically cutting prices, so-called predatory pricing. But you cannot find in history, you can find a lot of allegations that such things occur. You cannot find in history any successful use of such a strategy. You can find cases in the US, I'm sure probably also in Europe, where firms have been convicted of cutting prices too far as a means of protecting or gaining monopoly power. But if you look at all those cases, you can't find any evidence that consumers were harmed. You can find evidence that rivals were harmed. So the problem I have with a statute that allows the government to prosecute a firm that abuses monopoly power is that it's too easy for that term to be misused as an excuse to protect some firms from the greater competition posed by other firms. I just can't think, there's no way you can prove this because you're not in my head. But I've studied American economic history of the late 19th century pretty thoroughly. And I did it, I think, pretty open-mindedly. I can't think of a single instance of a company or an industry that didn't have special protections from competition, granted by the government. Restrictions on entry, restrictions on other firms selling their products in different states. I can't think of a single instance in which consumers have been harmed by alleged monopoly power. I can think of a lot of instances in which companies have been harmed by alleged monopoly power, but not a single instance in which consumers have been harmed. And if consumers aren't harmed, then my argument is that that's not really monopoly power. That's something different. That's bigness, it's unusual success that might look like monopoly power, because there's only one firm exercising it in many cases, but it's not really harmful.
Would you agree that for the most part the allegations of dumping is also something similar?
Yeah, dumping, of course, is predatory pricing across international borders. Yeah. Again, you can construct theories in which dumping leads to harm to consumers in the domestic economy. But the problem with constructing those kinds of theories, here's how I like to put it. The range of what is possible is huge. Most of what is possible in the world will never ever occur. It's possible that we'll all be killed within 5 minutes by an elephant falling through this roof. Right? It could be a flying circus overhead, and a plane explodes, and a couple of elephants crash through the roof, and we all die. That's possible, but surely not. You're not going to run out of the room and think, well, it's possible, I better leave the room. An elephant's going to fall through. So the range of what's possible is huge. It's possible that dumping can be damaging. You can't make policy based upon what's possible. You got to use theory, history, and wisdom, which is the most elusive of those things, to narrow the range of the possible to the range of the plausible. And if you can, to narrow that even further to the range of the probable. And that's where public policy should be made. So if history shows no example of price cutting to be a source of monopoly, none. And if the theory under which price cutting leads to monopoly is so detailed that everything has to be just right for it to work, then I think that the possibility of price cutting, using that as an example, to lead to monopoly is so remote that we can dismiss it in the same way that we dismiss the possibility that an elephant will fall through this room and kill us right now. Watch it happen. One last thing before we go, just an interesting story. Henry Ford is often credited with inventing the assembly line. And it is true that Henry Ford's automobiles were the very first product to be constructed on a modern assembly line. But Henry Ford himself said that he got the idea for the assembly line by looking at the way meat was produced in the meatpacking plants. He just reversed the process. He realized that what Gustavus Swift did is, Swift had a disassembly line. A whole product went in, and little pieces came out at the other end. And what Henry Ford did, that's where he got the idea, according to him. He reversed that. A bunch of little pieces will come in, and a whole product will roll out. So we can also credit Gustavus Swift for perhaps helping to invent the modern, affordable automobile. So he was a Swift guy. Okay, thank you.